Late afternoon sunlight slanted through the narrow shutters of the quartermaster's office, cutting a bright bar across Eleanor Marsh's cluttered desk. Outside the walls of Ardeleon Fortress, soldiers cheered and raised their cups, celebrating yet another victory claimed in the name of King Aldrich Thornwell. Meanwhile, Eleanor Marsh hunched over her ledgers, ink-stained fingers tracing down columns of numbers that seemed to stretch into infinity. Every line before Eleanor Marsh was not a tale of glory, but a list of the wounded, death stipends, and empty storehouses. Eleanor Marsh heard music drifting up from the courtyard, drums and flutes, and the latest song praising King Aldrich Thornwell as the chosen hero of the blade. Eleanor Marsh turned the page and sighed at a scrawled note. Payment delayed to next term. Campaign funds exhausted. The door to the room flew open, and General Hadrian Cole strode in, his cloak still dusted with the grime of the march. General Hadrian Cole rapped his knuckles on the edge of Eleanor Marsh's desk, making the stack of unchecked ledgers tremble.
I need answers.
General Hadrian Cole said that King Aldrich Thornwell needed a pleasing report to present to the noble council in the morning. Eleanor Marsh looked up, her shadowed eyes blinking once, and asked General Hadrian Cole whether he wanted true numbers or a pleasant story. General Hadrian Cole frowned and told Eleanor Marsh that the council did not care to hear of burned granaries and starving villagers right after a triumphant song. Eleanor Marsh closed one ledger, feeling something in her chest that resembled anger neatly ruled into boxes. Eleanor Marsh said that if King Aldrich Thornwell wanted glory, then someone at least had to count the exact price paid for it. General Hadrian Cole paused for a heartbeat, then told Eleanor Marsh that her duty was to make the numbers favor the kingdom of Ardeleon. When General Hadrian Cole left and the door thudded shut, only the words, "favor the kingdom," echoed in Eleanor Marsh's mind like a crooked miracle of accounting. That night, Eleanor Marsh went down to the wounded camp to check the payment lists, carrying a single candle and a fresh ledger. Inside the tent, the smell of antiseptic and sweat mingled with groans, while in Eleanor Marsh's hands lay a roster of names who would receive a single payment in place of an entire life. A young soldier asked Eleanor Marsh when his family would get the money and why the songs outside did not mention them.
Are we going home
Eleanor
soon?
Marsh did not answer directly. She added another mark in the ledger and promised the soldier she would not let his name vanish among the numbers. When Eleanor Marsh returned to her room, she found High Priestess Seraphine Doyle waiting in the shadows, her white ceremonial robe stark against the gray stone wall. High Priestess Seraphine Doyle smiled and told Eleanor Marsh that the Holy Sword Sumerel would soon be brought to the council hall as a symbol for the new peace accords.
I am certain
High
the
Priestess
Holy
Seraphine
Sword
Doyle
Sumerel
recounted the
will
legend
lead
that
us
one day
to victory.
the Holy Sword Sumerel would choose King Aldrich Thornwell and end all
Aldrich,
wars. As
long
Eleanor Marsh
chosen,
listened, she could
is
only
the
think of
one
the
to
unpaid
unite
columns of
all
war debts
kingdoms.
stretching like an invisible blade across the continent.
The ledger
High
is
Priestess
all I
Seraphine
see.
Doyle announced that Eleanor Marsh would accompany King Aldrich Thornwell's retinue to the Temple of Sumerel as quartermaster
You will
clerk.
accompany King
Eleanor Marsh
Aldrich
gaped,
on his
immediately
journey.
calculating in her head how many inventories, receipts, and
What?
compensation files she would have to bring to attend a pretend peace conference. After High Priestess Seraphine Doyle had gone, Eleanor Marsh stood alone in the room, looking out into the courtyard where people sang of victory beneath a night sky lit by campfires. Eleanor Marsh whispered to herself that if anything could truly end war, it would be the final ledger page where every debt had been crossed off.
Neatly struck through.
High above, the banner of Ardeleon snapped in the wind, while beneath it the fortress held storehouses running empty and promises left undone. Eleanor Marsh gathered her ledgers into a wooden chest, locked it, and felt as if she were binding an invisible beast called consequence. Before going to bed, Eleanor Marsh spread a map of the continent on her table and drew red circles around regions that had been battlefields and had not received a single coin in compensation. Eleanor Marsh looked at the tangled rings, and suddenly realized that the continent of Ardelion resembled a vast ledger no one had ever closed. Eleanor Marsh folded the map and told herself that when she went to the Temple of Sumerel, she meant to bring her ledgers, but absolutely no faith in the Holy Sword. At dawn the next morning, King Aldrich Thornwell's retinue left Ardelion Fortress to the clatter of hooves on stone. Eleanor Marsh swayed on the back of a borrowed horse, clutching the chest of ledgers as if it were a block of lead. Along the road, King Aldrich Thornwell occasionally turned to smile and wave at villagers, as if the morning were just another glorious parade. High Priestess Seraphine Doyle rode beside King Aldrich Thornwell, her white vestments billowing as she cradled a silver coffer of sacred regalia. Eleanor Marsh could only think of unsigned receipts and unbalanced inventories jostling along with the retinue, a reminder that the coming peace accords were mostly surface. Near midday, the party sighted the Temple of Sumerel, a massive block of white stone rising from the valley like a reversed sword driven into the earth. Eleanor Marsh squinted at the Temple of Sumerel, deciding it looked more like a colossal archive than a house of miracles. When the party reached the temple courtyard, the priests opened the gates and incense smoke and chanting rolled out like a wave. Eleanor Marsh dismounted, coughing on the thick incense, her hands still refusing to let go of the ledger chest. Inside the Temple of Sumerel's grand hall, tall stone columns rose like a row of rigid ledger lines, leading to the central chamber where the Holy Sword waited. When she entered the central chamber, Eleanor Marsh saw the Holy Sword Sumerel planted in the middle of a stone plinth, its dulled steel reflecting 1,000 candles. The Holy Sword Sumerel looked no larger than any other ceremonial blade, but the stone beneath it was carved full of kingdom names that had bled for the promise of eternal peace. High Priestess Seraphine Doyle raised her hands to begin the rite and invited King Aldrich Thornwell to step before the Holy Sword Sumerel. King Aldrich Thornwell knelt on one knee at the plinth and laid his hand on the hilt of the Holy Sword Sumerel, just like in every illustrated legend. Eleanor Marsh, standing among the nobles in the back, was handed a wooden tablet to record this historic moment in the proper format. King Aldrich Thornwell drew a deep breath, tightened his grip around the hilt of the Holy Sword Sumerel, and pulled, but the blade did not move even a fraction. An uncomfortable murmur rippled through the chamber as High Priestess Seraphine Doyle hastily declared it was merely a first trial. A broad-shouldered knight named Sir Damian Rivers was summoned next, his cloak rippling as he gripped the hilt of the Holy Sword Sumerel and heaved. Sir Damian Rivers flushed red, veins standing out in his neck, yet the Holy Sword Sumerel stayed rooted like a number refusing to be adjusted. Eleanor Marsh wrote on her tablet, "First right, 2 candidates. Result, no change in object status." To save face, High Priestess Seraphine Doyle allowed a few more knights and a distinguished lady to touch the Holy Sword Sumerel, but the result was still silence and cold steel. At last, High Priestess Seraphine Doyle signaled a halt and told everyone to take a recess while she prepared for the formal recording of the rite. A young acolyte led Eleanor Marsh closer to the plinth to sign the ritual record at High Priestess Seraphine Doyle's request. Eleanor Marsh, juggling the ledger chest and the record tablet, absent-mindedly put her free hand on the hilt of the Holy Sword Sumerel for balance. The instant Eleanor Marsh's fingers touched the hilt, the chamber vanished, leaving only white light and numbers swirling around her like flocks of birds. Eleanor Marsh looked at her own hand and saw flesh dissolve into invisible ledgers linking battles, indemnities, and broken promises. A cold, clear voice sounded inside Eleanor Marsh's mind. User link established. Eleanor Marsh. Occupation: Manager of War Consequences.
Eleanor Marsh.
Eleanor Marsh tried to yank her hand away from the Holy Sword Sumerel, but the white light held her a heartbeat longer. just long enough for campaign maps and casualty charts to flash before her eyes. System Sumeral, Multi-Kingdom Conflict Reconciliation Tool. Status, ledger unclosed for 12 generations. The voice continued inside Eleanor Marsh's head. Eleanor Marsh gasped, and suddenly everything snapped back. She was standing by the plinth, hand jerked away from the hilt of the Holy Sword Sumeral, heart racing. A small ripple of whispers rose as a few nearby witnesses claimed they had seen the Holy Sword Sumeral tremble slightly under Eleanor Marsh's touch before going still again. High Priestess Seraphine Doyle rushed over, seized Eleanor Marsh's hand, and pressed her for any holy sign she had felt from the Holy Sword Sumeral. Still dazed, Eleanor Marsh merely shook her head and said she had probably gotten dizzy from standing too long in the incense. High Priestess Seraphine Doyle narrowed her eyes, then proclaimed to the crowd that Sumeral has stirred, and that it was a favorable omen for King Aldrich Thornwell. King Aldrich Thornwell smiled, though a trace of disappointment lingered in his eyes because the Holy Sword Sumeral had not slid free of the stone for him. High Priestess Seraphine Doyle dismissed the rite, announcing that the rest would be signing and formal acknowledgments, where Eleanor Marsh was ordered to assist as scribe. When Eleanor Marsh finally sat on a wooden chair in the adjacent council room, that cold voice spoke again inside her head, as clearly as if the Holy Sword Sumeral were seated across from her. "User Eleanor Marsh," the voice of Sumeral said. "Would you like to view the war balance sheet of this continent?" Eleanor Marsh swallowed and answered silently that she had only been sent here to take minutes, not to converse with a sword that claimed to be a system. Sumeral replied calmly in Eleanor Marsh's mind that its purpose was to end wars by forcing kingdoms to close their ledgers, and that she was the first in generations to fit that job description. Eleanor Marsh closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the distant bickering of delegates in the council room and realizing that, like it or not, she had just been drafted into a new kind of work, accountant for the entire continent. That afternoon, the side council room held only Eleanor Marsh, a stack of documents, and the creak of a ceiling fan. Sumeral's voice sounded in Eleanor Marsh's mind, cold and even like an invisible secretary who had just clocked in. "Eleanor Marsh, it is time to view a small portion of the war balance sheet," Sumeral said, as if inviting her to open a report file. Eleanor Marsh propped her elbow on the real table, pressed her forehead into her hand, and muttered in thought that she had not signed up to be co-system with a sword. Sumeral ignored Eleanor Marsh's complaint and instead projected into her awareness a map of the continent overlaid with lines of red numbers. "This is the aggregated cost of war over the last 30 years, sorted by kingdom," Sumeral explained to Eleanor Marsh, its tone as flat as a ledger reading. Eleanor Marsh saw Ardelion burning brightest, its numbers piled like walls of debt rising around her own kingdom. Eleanor Marsh swallowed and asked Sumeral silently whether that figure included unpaid reparations or only official military expenses. "This is the official portion," Sumeral answered Eleanor Marsh. "If I added unpaid obligations, the red line would extend off the map." Eleanor Marsh let out a choked laugh, telling herself that at least someone in this world was honest about numbers, even if that someone was an ancient sword. Eleanor Marsh picked up a blank sheet and began copying down the figures Sumeral provided in sharp, neat handwriting like cuts of a blade. When the first table was complete, Eleanor Marsh titled it "Provisional Summary of War Expenses, Internal Viewing Only." Sumeral told Eleanor Marsh that this was only the expense side, while the income side consisted of political and economic gains everyone was trying not to record. Eleanor Marsh replied to Sumeral that she had never seen a kingdom voluntarily list its true gains when talking about peace. "That is precisely why a scribe is required," Sumeral said, "and Eleanor Marsh is the first accountant unit granted access to the source code." Eleanor Marsh looked up at a knock on the door and hastily hid the war summary beneath a stack of less sensitive files. Magister Elwyn Grayford entered, her legal robes whispering over the stone floor, eyes fixed on Eleanor Marsh, as if on a witness. Magister Elwyn Grayford introduced herself as the one tasked by the council to examine the unusual data Eleanor Marsh had provided.
Your mandate is clear.
Eleanor Marsh's heart sped up, but she still pulled the war summary out and laid it on the table before Magister Elwyn Grayford with fake composure. Magister Elwyn Grayford unfolded the summary, scanned the columns, and the normally straight lines of her eyebrows bent slightly inward. Magister Elwyn Grayford asked Eleanor Marsh in a steady voice where she had obtained these figures, since they matched sealed records held only by the courts. Eleanor Marsh glanced down at the table, then admitted half the truth, that the Holy Sword Summerall seemed to know more than any ordinary lump of steel had a right to. Magister Elwyn Grayford did not laugh. She merely exhaled and said that if the Holy Sword Summerall was the source, the courts would treat it as testimony from a 4th-century dead witness. Magister Elwyn Grayford proposed that Eleanor Marsh continue cooperating with the court to compile a war inquiry report based on what the Holy Sword Summerall supplied. As Eleanor Marsh left the room, Magister Elwyn Grayford remained seated, lightly touching the row of numbers that showed how deeply Ardelian was indebted to its own allies. That evening, King Aldrich Thornwell summoned Eleanor Marsh and Magister Elwyn Grayford to a private meeting with Ambassador Corvinus Hale and General Hadrian Cole. King Aldrich Thornwell demanded that Eleanor Marsh explain why the numbers she produced made Ardelian look more like a debtor than a victor. Eleanor Marsh kept her voice calm and told King Aldrich Thornwell that numbers did not care about victory songs, only about what remained unpaid. Ambassador Corvinus Hale smirked and told King Aldrich Thornwell that these numbers could be a weapon if wielded at the right moment on the negotiating table. General Hadrian Cole, in contrast, warned in a low voice that such a weapon would make no sound but could burn Ardelian's honor to ash if exposed. Magister Elwyn Grayford reminded King Aldrich Thornwell that if the courts used Eleanor Marsh and Summerall's data, many war debts would be forced into public payment. King Aldrich Thornwell pinched his brow and said that for years he had been promised the Holy Sword Summerall would bring him glory, not a ledger of debts. Eleanor Marsh thought privately that this was the problem with legends in general. No one ever said who would pay the bill. High Priestess Seraphine Doyle was called in late, and when she heard about the Holy Sword Summerall's role as war accountant, her face briefly set like drying cement. High Priestess Seraphine Doyle told King Aldrich Thornwell that the Holy Sword Summerall was a sacred symbol, not a tool for weighing old wounds. Eleanor Marsh cut in, reminding them that old wounds, if not properly recorded and treated, only waited for a chance to fester. Summerall whispered a single line in Eleanor Marsh's head. Statement accurate. Like a system ticking a checkbox. At last, King Aldrich Thornwell decided to allow Magister Elwyn Grayford and Eleanor Marsh to continue working with Summerall, but ordered that all reports pass through him before release. As everyone departed, General Hadrian Cole passed by and murmured in Eleanor Marsh's ear that at least now someone was counting correctly how many people died for the decisions made in this room. That night, Eleanor Marsh sat alone with Summerall and began drafting the first war reconciliation statement, knowing that every line would trigger a small earthquake in the old order. The next morning, Eleanor Marsh realized that rumors traveled faster than any report when she walked into the temple corridor and heard people whispering the word Summerall, as if discussing a scandal. A knot of nobles avoided Eleanor Marsh's eyes, yet she still caught words like debt ledger, reparations, and must not be exposed. Summerall whispered in Eleanor Marsh's mind that the resistance phase had begun, as if ticking off the next step in a procedure. In the main council chamber, Ambassador Corvinus Hale was explaining to a cluster of delegates that Eleanor Marsh's figures could be adjusted to serve the common good. Eleanor Marsh stood in the doorway and heard Ambassador Corvinus Hale use the phrase, "remove destabilizing details," to describe deleting inconvenient deaths. General Hadrian Cole saw Eleanor Marsh, gestured her inside, and seated her beside him, as if he wanted her to witness firsthand how people tried to edit the truth.
We are ready.
A delegate from another kingdom suggested that King Aldrich Thornwell keep the holy sword Sumeril as a symbol and prevent its dangerous tool of data from spreading. High Priestess Seraphine Doyle immediately agreed, saying that the holy sword Sumeril belonged on an altar, not in Eleanor Marsh's ledgers or Magister Elowin Greyford's courts. Magister Elowin Greyford replied that if the holy sword Sumeril had spoken through numbers, then the law could not pretend to be deaf. King Aldrich Thornwell sat between them, his eyes moving back and forth as if watching two different versions of the same legend wrestle in front of him. Sumeril coldly noted in Eleanor Marsh's mind, "Religious variable and political variable are attempting to eliminate a counting variable." After the session, in the corridor, a silver-haired count blocked Eleanor Marsh's path and hinted that a personal contribution might make some numbers disappear. Eleanor Marsh answered the count bluntly that she was not a ledger demon selling other people's souls for prettier figures. That night, anonymous pamphlets appeared around the temple, showing Eleanor Marsh clutching the holy sword Sumeril like a traitor trying to ransom the entire continent. General Hadrian Cole brought one of the leaflets to show Eleanor Marsh, his face darkening at how cheap ink was being used to smear the work of counting real bodies. Normal reaction, Sumeril observed in Eleanor Marsh's mind. Systems attack the recorder before they attack the record. A few days later, Commander Lucian Barrett, a famously hardline officer, proposed that the council form a guard detail to protect the holy sword Sumeril from information misuse. Ambassador Corvinus Hale smiled and added that such a guard could also assist in managing the communications of Eleanor Marsh. Magister Elowin Greyford objected, saying that if anyone was to be overprotected, it should be the witness and the scribe, not the blade. King Aldrich Thornwell, caught between councils, postponed the decision and dismissed the session, leaving Eleanor Marsh in the midst of people who now looked at her like a risk variable. On her way back to the staff quarters, Eleanor Marsh crossed the inner courtyard, where three unfamiliar soldiers pretended to spar while their eyes never left her. Sumeril said softly in Eleanor Marsh's mind, "Probability of attempts to neutralize the recorder has risen 17% since yesterday." That evening, when Eleanor Marsh left her office late, the passage toward the archives was suddenly deserted. The lamps dimmed as if someone had arranged extra darkness. A figure stepped out from a dark corner, then two more, blocking Eleanor Marsh's way with a pose of feigned calm. The one in the middle, a young soldier bearing the insignia of Commander Lucian Barrett, said they had orders to escort Eleanor Marsh back to her quarters by a shortcut. Eleanor Marsh replied that she preferred routes with more witnesses, and shifted as if to step around them. A hand seized Eleanor Marsh's arm, twisting her wrist, while someone behind her pressed a cloth over her mouth. Before darkness and the sharp chemical scent could drown her, General Hadrian Cole's shout rang out, and his heavy frame slammed into the scene like a battlefield collision. General Hadrian Cole wrenched the man off Eleanor Marsh and slammed him against the stone wall as the one behind her toppled from a sudden kick. The soldier wearing Commander Lucian Barrett's insignia started to draw a knife, but seeing General Hadrian Cole's sword bared, he dropped his weapon and raised his hands. "Escorted the wrong person," General Hadrian Cole growled, eyes locked on him, while his free hand steadied Eleanor Marsh. When guards were summoned and dragged the three attackers away, Eleanor Marsh realized her knees were shaking and her palms were wet with sweat. General Hadrian Cole asked Eleanor Marsh, voice lowered, whether Sumeril had predicted this incident. Eleanor Marsh replied that Sumeril had warned of the probability, but the system could not decide for her whether she should keep counting. That night in her small room, Eleanor Marsh laid the first war reconciliation statement beside the oil lamp and looked at the numbers as if they were a cliff face others had just tried to push her from. Sumeril spoke in Eleanor Marsh's mind, this time less cold and more deliberate. "This is the hardest step in any closing. accepting that some will want to destroy the ledger along with the scribe. Eleanor Marsh asked in thought whether, if she stopped now, Sumeril would find another accounting unit, or simply sleep for a few more centuries. Sumeril answered Eleanor Marsh that it could wait, but the debts on the map could not. They would keep accruing interest in hatred and hunger. Eleanor Marsh drew a deep breath, set her hand on the report's cover, and said softly, to herself, to Sumeril, and to the dead, that she would keep counting until the ledger was truly closed, or until they truly silenced her. Sumeril marked that statement in Eleanor Marsh's mind with a simple note: Recorder accepts risk. Advance to public confrontation phase. A few weeks after the failed attack, Eleanor Marsh's first war reconciliation statement had quietly reached the courts, and the first response from Dominion Varestia was to move troops to the border. In the map room, General Hadrian Cole pointed at the fresh line of Varestian markers and told King Aldrich Thornwell that the other side had chosen intimidation over negotiation. Ambassador Corvinus Hale, standing nearby, explained that Dominion Varestia had declared Eleanor Marsh's figures deliberate defamation and demanded they be struck from all records. Sumeril whispered in Eleanor Marsh's mind that the probability of Dominion Varestia choosing war to avoid repayment was rising by the day. King Aldrich Thornwell slammed his fist on the table and asked Eleanor Marsh why a report for peace was pushing the continent toward yet another war. Eleanor Marsh kept her voice level and told King Aldrich Thornwell that because no one had ever truly closed the books, every mention of peace sounded like a collection notice to Dominion Varestia. Magister Elowin Greyford, summoned to the room, suggested that instead of retreating, Ardelian should use Sumeril's numbers to propose a war reconciliation accord that could not be easily denied. Ambassador Corvinus Hale smiled faintly and said that if crafted carefully, such an accord would force Dominion Varestia to choose between signing or exposing itself as a debtor before the whole continent. General Hadrian Cole nodded, adding that if the accord succeeded, not only Dominion Varestia, but Ardelian as well would be forced to pay the rest of its own debts. King Aldrich Thornwell looked from Magister Elowin Greyford to Ambassador Corvinus Hale to General Hadrian Cole, and finally to Eleanor Marsh, then said he wanted a document strong enough to replace a battle. Over the following days, Eleanor Marsh practically lived in the drafting room, working with Magister Elowin Greyford and Sumeril to sketch out each clause of the War Reconciliation Accord. Sumeril fed Eleanor Marsh consequence scenarios for each debt left unpaid, appearing in her mind as visions of borderlands smoldering for decades more. Eleanor Marsh wrote the reparation clauses not in the language of revenge, but of someone intent on closing a ledger for good, even if it hurt both winners and losers. Magister Elowin Greyford added court mechanisms and oversight provisions to ensure no kingdom could sign and then quietly default as before. Ambassador Corvinus Hale, invited to review the draft, tweaked certain phrases so leaders could swallow the truth without choking on pride. When the War Reconciliation Accord was complete, the title on the first page, written in Eleanor Marsh's own hand, stood clear as a final sentence pronounced over the continent. The signing day was set, and the great hall of the Temple of Sumeril was cleared to hold a long table, with the holy sword Sumeril standing tall on its stone plinth at the head of the room. The Dominion Varestia delegation entered in steel-gray cloaks, their faces as cold as their own fortress walls. The Varestian ambassador, Lord Malvern Caro, declared as soon as he sat that the accord was acceptable only if Ardelian likewise laid all its debts bare before the public eye.
Amenable?
Eleanor Marsh replied that this was precisely what the War Reconciliation Accord demanded, not only of Ardelian, but of every name carved into the holy sword Sumeril's plinth. High Priestess Seraphine Doyle rose to lead a brief rite, laid her hand on the hilt of the holy sword Sumeril, and proclaimed that every word spoken today was uttered before the oldest witness of war. As the rite ended, 3 members of the Dominion Varestia party suddenly sprang up and rushed toward the holy sword Sumeril's plinth at a speed unsuited to diplomacy. One of them pulled a vial of oil from his cloak, clearly intending to splash it over the holy sword Sumeril's plinth, and the accord laid beside it, burning both symbol and ledger. Before the guards could react, Sumeril shouted a string of commands and a schematic of the temple into Eleanor Marsh's mind, showing her exactly where to signal to stop them. Eleanor Marsh leapt up and shouted to the temple guards on the balcony to pull the archway lock lever at once, as if she had practiced this for years. The vaulted ceiling groaned and ancient iron grates slid down, sealing the passage between the table and the holy sword Sumeril's plinth, trapping all three attackers in a narrow stone compartment. The oil vial slipped from its wielder's hand and rolled across the stone floor, but a quick kick from General Hadrian Cole outside the grating sent it skittering safely away from the holy sword Sumeril. In the chaos, some delegates shouted for adjournment, while others yelled that this proved Dominion Varestia had never intended to negotiate in good faith. Lord Malvern Caro flushed red and claimed it was merely the rogue act of extremists, but the derisive murmurs around the room said otherwise. Sumeril, sensing opportunity, pushed into Eleanor Marsh's mind a stream of images of the damage war would cause. Severed trade routes, Varestian fishing villages burning, Ardelion granaries empty. Eleanor Marsh stepped into the center of the hall, held up a copy of the War Reconciliation Accord, waited for the noise to ebb, and said that they were standing at a crossroads. Sign the accord, or watch those visions become real. Eleanor Marsh read aloud selected sections. Lists of debts, plans for reconstruction, oversight provisions, her voice like successive hammer blows nailing war's coffin shut. Magister Elowin Grayford stood to support her, declaring that if Dominion Varestia signed, the courts would ensure no one used the accord to humiliate them, only to make all parties fulfill their obligations. General Hadrian Cole added that the Ardelian army supported the accord because his soldiers had already paid enough blood for decisions made on paper. At last, all eyes turned to King Aldric Thornwell, who had to decide whether to sign the document that would hang Ardelion and Dominion Varestia on the same hook of justice. King Aldric Thornwell took up the pen, glanced at Eleanor Marsh, and slowly signed his name beneath the line, "For the Kingdom of Ardelion." After a heavy pause, Lord Malvern Caro also rose, face hard as stone, and signed the "For Dominion Varestia" line with a stroke that nearly carved the parchment. One by one, the other representatives signed until the War Reconciliation Accord was crowded with names. Like a final invoice, the entire continent was forced to accept. As hot wax seals were impressed, Sumeril murmured in Eleanor Marsh's mind that war's gravitational pull has dropped sharply, but not to zero. Eleanor Marsh looked at the holy sword Sumeril on its plinth and thought that today it had not moved an inch, yet had done what for centuries people assumed only blood could accomplish. As the hall emptied, King Aldric Thornwell passed by and quietly told Eleanor Marsh that in future songs people would likely remember only his name, but he would know who had truly closed the books. Eleanor Marsh answered that she did not much care for songs as long as the ledger stayed closed, and Sumeril marked that statement with a satisfied note in her mind. 3 months after the War Reconciliation Accord was signed, the neutral city of Cauldron became a place where people brought not armies but wagons piled high with ledgers and seals. On a hill overlooking the city, the new council house had been hastily built of gray stone, flying the banner of Ardelion beside the banner of Dominion Varestia, this time at the same height. Inside, Eleanor Marsh was given a new office with a small plaque on the door reading, "Office of War Reconciliation,
Very well.
Chief Clerk Eleanor Marsh." On a small stone pedestal in the corner, they had
Accord
placed a symbolic
executed,
replica of the holy
monitoring
sword
phase
Sumeril,
begins.
but Sumeril's real voice still spoke in Eleanor Marsh's mind without any need for symbols. Sumeril informed Eleanor Marsh that the war pressure on the map had dropped further, but a reparation resistance field still blinked red in several border regions. On the first day, Eleanor Marsh signed for 12 caravans of Ardelian reparations, gold coins, grain, farming tools, things once counted as spoils, now recorded as returns. From Dominion Varestia, the delegation brought a stack of complaints thicker than their payment vouchers, protesting that the sums they owed did not account for national pride. Magister Elowin Grayford set up a temporary courtroom downstairs, hearing case after small case about whether a village had over or underestimated its losses compared to the accord's forms. General Hadrian Cole spent most of his days riding along the supply routes, making sure wagons bearing Ardelian's flag did not lose a few crates along the way. High Priestess Seraphine Doyle, reluctant but resolute, shifted most hymns about Sumerel from sword of glory to sword of justice, though some worshippers frowned at the new lyrics. Commander Lucian Barrett, meanwhile, was brought before a military tribunal for abuse of protective authority, and Sumerel, when asked, confirmed to Eleanor Marsh that all three of her attackers had taken orders directly from him. Rumor had it that King Aldrich Thornwell demoted Commander Lucian Barrett to overseeing a remote grain depot, where his only commands would be to store mice and inventory sheets. In those first months, Eleanor Marsh received dozens of anonymous letters, some cursing her, some thanking her, some containing only a list of the dead, with the line, "Do not let them be lost again in the ledger." One evening, Sumerel showed Eleanor Marsh a small village in Dominion Varestia that had just received enough reparations to rebuild its bridge, and the arguments about war in the local taverns suddenly grew quieter. On another morning, Sumerel showed Eleanor Marsh a border town in Ardelian, grumbling about sharing its grain, yet its streets were free of conscription patrols. Sumerel summarized for Eleanor Marsh in one dry line, "Short-term resentment costs are approximately 3 orders of magnitude lower than long-term war expenditure." On a rainy day, High Priestess Seraphine Doyle visited the Office of War Reconciliation, left her wet sandals at the door, and asked to see Sumerel's latest miracles, but in numbers rather than legends. Eleanor Marsh showed High Priestess Seraphine Doyle a chart of armed clashes declining after each round of payments, and for the first time saw the priestess fall silent because of numbers, not prayer. That night, when the building was quiet, Sumerel told Eleanor Marsh that the current war ledger was nearly balanced, with an error margin a single generation could endure without reaching for guns. Eleanor Marsh asked Sumerel what that meant for their link. Would the sword fall silent, sleep again, or keep whispering figures in her ear for the rest of her life? Sumerel replied that the current war cycle had been closed, and that the system was designed to withdraw from the user's mind when constant connection was no longer needed, leaving only an emergency line for future audits. Eleanor Marsh chuckled softly and told Sumerel it was the first time she had seen a legend volunteer to have less presence in people's lives. Sumerel answered that it was not a legend, merely a tool that had completed a large task, and the best tools were the ones that could be put away when the job was done. The next morning, Eleanor Marsh woke to an oddly quiet mind. Sumerel no longer spoke, lying there instead like a dim light, waiting for someone to begin cheating with war again. Years passed, and the War Reconciliation Accord was taught in classrooms as a dry historical milestone, where King Aldrich Thornwell's name stood in bold, and Eleanor Marsh's appeared only in the footnotes. In a quiet house in Cauldron, an older Eleanor Marsh sat by the window, carefully entering small numbers into a household expense book like any ordinary widow. Sometimes, when she heard of some distant lord speaking too loudly about glory on the battlefield, Eleanor Marsh felt Sumerel's dim light flicker and a warning number appear at the edge of her awareness. But the number would recede again, because the courts and reparation offices of many kingdoms, structures built from that first accord, were now strong enough to handle would-be war dreamers without needing Sumerel's direct voice. In the Temple of Sumerel, the true sword still stood on its stone plinth, pilgrims touching the hilt for luck, unaware that its greatest miracle had long since taken place in pages they would never read. Deep in Sumerel's locked consciousness, a final note was stored. War cycle, closed, recorder, released, system, continuing low-level monitoring. And Eleanor Marsh, each time she closed that day's expense book, still drew one firm straight line beneath the total, as if reminding herself that some wars, once reconciled to the end, should never be reopened.